Long before the rise of Rome, before the marble temples of Greece, before the philosophies that shaped the modern world, a civilization emerged beside a river that refused to obey the laws of the desert, the Nile. In a land where rain almost never fell and the earth was otherwise lifeless sand, a ribbon of water carved a path through the harshness of northeastern Africa. Each year it flooded its banks with quiet predictability, leaving behind dark soil so rich that life flourished where none should have existed. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not merely geography. It was divine order. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt would become one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. Kingdoms rose and fell, dynasties appeared and vanished, temples were built and buried by time. Yet the essence of Egypt, its language, beliefs, and vision of eternity, persisted longer than almost any empire that followed. It produced monuments so colossal that even today they dominate the imagination of the world. It developed religious ideas that attempted to explain death, immortality, justice, and cosmic balance. It created a state powerful enough to organize millions of people long before modern technology existed. And yet the true story of Egypt is not only about pyramids or pharaohs. It is a story about how human beings first learned to build civilization on a massive scale. But the origins of Egypt do not begin with kings. They begin with survival. 10,000 years ago, the climate of North Africa looked very different from what we see today. Vast regions that are now desert were once fertile grasslands dotted with lakes and wildlife. Early human communities lived as hunters and gatherers, moving with seasonal patterns of animals and vegetation. But the climate began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the rains retreated, lakes dried, grasslands withered into dust. Over centuries, the Sahara transformed from a green landscape into the largest desert on Earth. Human populations were pushed toward the only reliable source of water left, the Nile Valley. Here, a new way of life began to form. The river's annual flooding deposited black sediment across its banks, creating one of the most fertile agricultural zones on the planet. Communities discovered that crops could be planted after each flood, producing reliable harvests year after year. Agriculture changed everything. Permanent settlements appeared along the riverbanks. Villages grew into small regional cultures. Pottery, trade, and craft specialization developed. People began to organize irrigation channels and storage systems. For the first time, large numbers of humans were bound together by shared land and shared survival. But these early societies were not yet Egypt. Archaeologists call them the pre-dynastic cultures, scattered communities that existed thousands of years before the first pharaoh ever wore a crown. Two major cultural zones emerged along the Nile. Upper Egypt, in the southern narrow valley surrounded by cliffs and desert, and Lower Egypt, in the vast northern delta where the river spread into multiple branches before reaching the Mediterranean Sea. These regions developed different traditions, different symbols, and different centers of power. In Upper Egypt, settlements such as Hierakonpolis and Naqada grew into strong regional authorities. Leaders emerged who controlled trade routes reaching deep into Africa and the Near East. Gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals passed through these networks. Power began to concentrate. Burials became more elaborate, suggesting that certain individuals held special authority. Tombs were filled with luxury goods, weapons, and ritual objects that signaled early forms of elite status. The idea of kingship was beginning to form. Meanwhile, Lower Egypt developed its own centers of influence within the Fertile Delta. Here, access to Mediterranean trade routes connected communities to cultures across the eastern Mediterranean. But as populations expanded and resources became increasingly organized, competition between regions intensified. Control of the Nile meant control of life itself. Over time, rival leaders sought dominance beyond their local territories. Warfare, alliances, and political marriages reshaped the balance of power. Gradually, Upper Egypt began to gain the advantage. Archaeological evidence suggests that southern rulers developed stronger military organization and broader political authority. Their influence spread northward along the river. One figure would eventually stand above all others. His name echoes through the earliest written records of Egyptian civilization. Narmer. Around 3100 BCE, Narmer achieved what no ruler before him had accomplished. He unified Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown. One of the most famous artifacts in ancient Egyptian history, the Narmer Palette, depicts this moment symbolically. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. Together, they represent the birth of a single kingdom. For the first time in history, the entire Nile Valley from the delta to the southern cataracts was ruled by one central authority. This unification created something unprecedented, a territorial state. Narmer's capital was likely established at Memphis, strategically positioned between Upper and Lower Egypt. From this location, the king could administer both regions and control trade moving along the Nile. But Narmer was more than a conqueror. He established the ideological foundations of Egyptian kingship. The king was not merely a political leader. He was divine. Egyptian belief held that the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god of the sky. Through him, cosmic order, known as Ma'at, was maintained. Ma'at represented balance, truth, justice, and harmony between humanity and the gods. Without the king, chaos would consume the world. This concept justified absolute authority. It also created a powerful unifying identity for the newly formed kingdom. Religion, politics, and society became inseparable. The earliest dynasties that followed Narmer's reign worked to solidify this system. Administrative officials were appointed to manage agriculture, collect taxes, oversee irrigation, and record resources. Writing itself evolved during this period. Hieroglyphs, one of the world's earliest writing systems, emerged as a tool for administration and sacred communication. Symbols carved into stone and painted on papyrus allowed officials to track goods, document rituals, and preserve royal achievements. Record-keeping turned memory into history. The royal court became the center of Egyptian life. Artisans, priests, scribes, and engineers gathered around the pharaoh's authority. Temples began to appear along the Nile, dedicated to gods who governed natural forces and cosmic principles. At the same time, Egyptian culture developed a profound relationship with death. To Egyptians, death was not an end. It was a transformation. They believed that the human soul, composed of several spiritual elements, could live eternally if the body was preserved and the proper rituals were performed. Tombs became carefully constructed gateways between the mortal world and the afterlife. Even in these early dynasties, elaborate burial practices appeared. Grave goods included food, tools, jewelry, and symbolic objects intended to assist the deceased in the next life. But these tombs were only the beginning. The scale of royal burial would soon grow beyond anything the ancient world had ever seen. The state continued to expand its capabilities. Agricultural production along the Nile generated enormous surpluses of grain. These surpluses allowed the government to feed large labor forces during the flood season when farming temporarily stopped. Labor could now be mobilized on a national scale. Stone quarries were opened. Transport systems along the river were organized. Skilled craftsmen developed techniques for cutting limestone and shaping monumental structures. A civilization that began as scattered villages was evolving into a complex bureaucratic state. Yet the true transformation of Egypt was still approaching. During the centuries following unification, royal authority strengthened generation after generation. Each new ruler built upon the administrative and religious foundations established by his predecessors. The pharaoh was no longer just a king. He was the axis of the universe. Egyptians believed that as long as the king ruled with divine favor, The Nile would flood, crops would grow, and order would prevail. But maintaining such power required visible proof. The pharaoh needed monuments that demonstrated his connection to eternity. The first great experiments in monumental architecture began with royal tomb complexes constructed from mud brick and stone. These structures evolved from simple burial pits into increasingly elaborate compounds with chapels, courtyards, and ceremonial pathways. Architects began to think not just in terms of buildings. They thought in terms of eternity. Then, around the 27th century BCE, a revolutionary idea emerged: a step toward the sky. Under the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, a brilliant architect named Imhotep designed something the world had never seen before. The step pyramid at Saqqara. Stacked layers of stone rose upward like a staircase for the king's soul to ascend into the heavens. It was the first monumental structure ever built entirely from cut stone. The pyramid changed everything. It demonstrated that Egypt possessed the administrative organization, engineering skill, and centralized power to reshape the landscape itself. And if one pyramid could be built, larger ones could follow. Future rulers would attempt projects so massive that they would redefine the limits of human ambition. But ambition carries consequences. As royal power expanded and monumental construction consumed enormous resources, the Egyptian state would face challenges it had never encountered before. Political rivalries would emerge. Regional governors would gain influence. The delicate balance of divine authority and earthly administration would be tested. The civilization born beside the Nile was entering a new phase, one defined by extraordinary creativity, immense labor, and the relentless pursuit of immortality. The age of pyramids was about to begin, and with it, Egypt would rise to heights that would astonish the ancient world and echo across millennia. But the monuments that symbolized eternal power would also reveal the fragile nature of human ambition, because even the greatest civilization must one day confront the limits of its own creation. The desert wind moved silently across the plateau of Saqqara, carrying grains of sand over a structure unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. A staircase made of stone rising toward the heavens. To the people of Egypt, it was not simply a monument. It was a declaration, a statement that the power of the pharaoh extended beyond life itself and into eternity. The step pyramid of Djoser marked the beginning of an era historians would later call the Old Kingdom, the first great age of monumental kingship. It was a time when the Egyptian state reached a level of organization and confidence that allowed rulers to reshape the landscape with projects so massive they still dominate the earth more than 4,000 years later. But the rise of the Pyramid Age was not inevitable. It required vision. It required control. And above all, it required a state capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of people for a single purpose. The architect behind the step pyramid was a man named Imhotep. Unlike most figures from ancient Egypt, whose identities are hidden behind royal titles and fading inscriptions, Imhotep's legacy would echo through centuries. He served as chancellor to Pharaoh Djoser, a high priest, engineer, and physician. In later generations, he would even be worshipped as a god of wisdom. But during his lifetime, he faced a challenge no architect had ever encountered. How do you build eternity? Before Djoser, royal tombs had been relatively modest structures known as mastabas, flat-roofed buildings made from mud brick that covered underground burial chambers. They served their purpose, but they did not yet embody the grand cosmic symbolism Egyptian religion was beginning to demand. Imhotep transformed this tradition. Instead of a single mastaba, he stacked several layers one above another, each smaller than the one beneath it. The result was a six-tiered pyramid rising more than 60 meters above the desert floor. But the structure itself was only part of the design. Surrounding the pyramid was an enormous ceremonial complex filled with courtyards, temples, shrines, and colonnades. Walls more than 10 meters high enclosed the sacred space, separating the divine realm of the king from the ordinary world. Within this complex, rituals were performed to ensure that Djoser would rule forever in the afterlife. The project required unprecedented coordination. Stone blocks weighing several tons had to be quarried, transported across the Nile, shaped with copper tools, and lifted into position with carefully organized labor. Thousands of workers, craftsmen, and administrators participated in the effort. But contrary to popular myth, these workers were not slaves. Evidence from archaeological excavations reveals that many were skilled laborers who lived in organized communities near the construction sites. They were fed by state granaries and worked during the Nile's annual flooding season when agricultural labor paused. The pyramid was not simply a tomb, it was a national enterprise. The success of Djoser's pyramid inspired future pharaohs to pursue even more ambitious projects. Each new ruler sought to surpass the achievements of his predecessor, creating monuments that would guarantee his name would never fade from memory. But ambition comes with risk. One of Djoser's successors, Pharaoh Sneferu, would push the limits of pyramid construction further than anyone before him. Sneferu ruled during the Fourth Dynasty, and his reign marked one of the most creative architectural periods in Egyptian history. Determined to perfect the pyramid form, he launched multiple massive construction projects across Egypt. His first attempt was the pyramid at Meidum. Originally designed as a step pyramid, it was later modified into a smooth-sided structure. But the engineering techniques of the time were still evolving, and the outer layers eventually collapsed, leaving behind a towering core that still stands today like a mysterious stone tower in the desert. Sneferu did not give up. His next project was the bent pyramid at Dahshur. This structure began with steep sides, but partway through construction the angle was changed dramatically, creating the distinctive bent appearance that gives the monument its name. Historians believe the adjustment was made because the original design threatened structural failure. The change prevented collapse but produced a shape unlike any other pyramid. Even this was not enough. Sneferu ordered yet another pyramid to be built, also at Dahshur. This time, architects carefully refined their methods, choosing a safer angle from the beginning. The result was the Red Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history. Sneferu had effectively solved the engineering challenges that would make the greatest monuments of Egypt possible, and his son would take that achievement to its ultimate extreme. Khufu. To the Greeks, he would later be known as Cheops. But in Egypt his name carried an authority that echoed across the Nile Valley. When Khufu ascended the throne around 2589 BCE, he inherited a powerful and stable kingdom. The administrative systems created over generations allowed the pharaoh to command enormous resources. Khufu used that power to begin the most ambitious construction project the world had ever seen. On the Giza Plateau, just west of the Nile near modern Cairo, workers began laying the foundation for a structure that would dominate the skyline for millennia. The Great Pyramid of Giza. Its scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Originally standing at about 146 meters tall, the pyramid was the tallest structure on Earth for more than 3,800 years. It was built from approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing several tons. Some granite beams inside the pyramid weigh more than 70 tons and were transported hundreds of kilometers from quarries in southern Egypt. The precision of the construction remains astonishing. The base of the pyramid is aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west. The four sides meet with extraordinary accuracy, forming one of the most geometrically precise structures ever built. Yet the pyramid was not constructed in isolation. Khufu's pyramid was the center of a vast complex that included temples, causeways, boat pits, and smaller pyramids for royal family members. Entire towns were established nearby to house the workforce responsible for its construction. Recent discoveries have revealed bakeries, breweries, and administrative buildings that supported thousands of workers. The pyramid was not just a tomb. It was the ultimate expression of divine kingship. To the Egyptians, the pyramid symbolized the primordial mound from which creation first emerged in their cosmology. Its shape also reflected the rays of the sun, linking the king to the solar deity Ra. Through this monument, Khufu proclaimed his transformation into an eternal god, but Khufu's reign remains mysterious. Unlike many other pharaohs, relatively few inscriptions describe his achievements. Later Greek historians portrayed him as a harsh ruler who oppressed his people to build the pyramid. Modern archaeology paints a more complicated picture. Evidence suggests that while the project required immense labor, it was part of a highly organized state system that provided food, housing, and social structure for workers. After Khufu's death, his successors continued the tradition. His son Khafre built the second Great Pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller but positioned on higher ground, giving it an equally imposing presence. Nearby stands one of the most enigmatic monuments of the ancient world, the Great Sphinx. Carved from a single limestone ridge, the Sphinx depicts a massive lion with the head of a pharaoh, likely representing Khafre himself. With its calm expression gazing toward the rising sun, the statue symbolized royal strength and divine protection. Khafre's successor, Menkaure, constructed the third pyramid at Giza. Though smaller than the others, it completed the monumental triad that still defines the plateau today. For centuries, the pyramids of Giza represented the absolute peak of royal ambition. They demonstrated that Egypt possessed unmatched resources, technological skill, and centralized authority. But maintaining such grand projects placed enormous pressure on the state. Each pyramid required decades of planning, massive labor forces, and immense quantities of stone, food, and administrative coordination. Over time, the balance of power within Egypt began to shift. Regional governors known as nomarchs gained increasing influence as they managed local agricultural production and tax collection. Their positions gradually became hereditary, creating powerful local dynasties. Meanwhile, royal building projects continued to demand vast resources. Later kings of the Old Kingdom constructed pyramids as well, but none reached the scale or perfection of those at Giza. Many were smaller and built with inferior materials, reflecting changing economic realities. The authority of the pharaoh remained sacred in theory. But in practice, the centralized power that had made the Pyramid Age possible was beginning to weaken. As the Sixth Dynasty approached its end, Egypt faced a combination of challenges. Long reigns created succession uncertainties. Regional officials became increasingly independent. Climate changes may have disrupted the Nile's flooding patterns, reducing agricultural productivity. Gradually, the immense machine of the Old Kingdom began to fracture. What had once been the most stable and unified state in the ancient world started to fragment into competing regions. The monuments of the Pyramid Age still stood in silent defiance of time, but the political system that built them was beginning to crumble. And as the authority of the pharaoh faded, Egypt would enter one of the most uncertain and chaotic periods in its long history. The age of divine certainty was ending. A new era of struggle was about to begin. The pyramids still stood. Their massive silhouettes cast long shadows across the desert west of the Nile, monuments of stone that seemed immune to the passage of time. To anyone gazing upon them, they proclaimed a simple message. Egypt was eternal, but monuments can outlive the systems that create them. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the immense authority once held by the pharaoh had begun to fracture. The carefully balanced machinery of centralized government, tax collection, labor mobilization, agricultural management, and regional administration was slowly slipping out of royal control. The pyramids of Giza had been built through the combined strength of a unified kingdom. Now that unity was beginning to dissolve. The final rulers of the Sixth Dynasty presided over a state that appeared stable on the surface, but was weakening beneath. One of the most significant figures of this era was Pharaoh Pepi II, who according to later records may have ruled for more than 90 years. Such a long reign created unusual problems. Generations of officials served under the same king, gaining influence and authority over time. Regional governors, known as nomarchs, became powerful figures in their own provinces. Their positions, once temporary appointments by the crown, gradually turned into hereditary titles passed from father to son. This subtle shift changed the political structure of Egypt. Instead of power flowing entirely from the pharaoh in Memphis, authority began to spread outward to local elites who controlled resources within their territories. These officials collected taxes, managed irrigation, and commanded regional labor forces. Over time, their loyalty to the central government weakened. Meanwhile, environmental conditions may have made the situation worse. Evidence from geological studies suggests that around 2200 BCE, the Nile experienced unusually low flooding cycles for several years. Because Egyptian agriculture depended entirely on these floods to deposit fertile soil, poor inundations could devastate crop yields. Food shortages began to appear. When harvests failed, the authority of the pharaoh, who was believed to guarantee the natural balance of the universe, came into question. If the king truly maintained cosmic order, why were the floods failing? The ideological foundation of kingship itself began to tremble. As royal authority weakened, Egypt entered a period historians now call the First Intermediate Period. The phrase may sound technical, but the reality behind it was far more dramatic. For the first time since the unification of Narmer, Egypt was no longer governed by a single ruler. Instead, competing centers of power emerged across the Nile Valley. In the north, rulers based in the city of Heracleopolis claimed authority over Lower Egypt. In the south, rival dynasties based in Thebes asserted control over Upper Egypt. Between these regions lay territories governed by independent nomarchs who often acted as semi-autonomous kings within their own domains. Egypt had fractured. Yet this period was not simply an age of chaos and collapse, as early historians once believed. Recent archaeological discoveries reveal a more complex picture. While the central government weakened, regional cultures flourished. Local rulers built tombs decorated with vibrant paintings and inscriptions that reflected pride in their communities. Art became more expressive and less rigidly controlled by royal standards. Literature began to explore themes of uncertainty, social justice, and personal reflection. In a strange way, the decline of centralized power allowed Egyptian culture to diversify, but political instability remained a constant threat. Competition between regional rulers frequently erupted into conflict. Trade routes became less secure. Irrigation systems that once depended on coordinated national management fell into neglect in some areas. The Nile still flowed, but the unity that had once defined Egyptian civilization was gone. Amid this fragmentation, one city gradually rose to prominence: Thebes. Located in Upper Egypt, Thebes had originally been a provincial center during the Old Kingdom. But during the First Intermediate Period, its rulers began expanding their influence northward along the Nile. Among them emerged a line of leaders who would eventually reunify the kingdom. The most decisive figure was Mentuhotep II. Ascending the throne around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep inherited a Theban state already engaged in a long struggle against the northern rulers of Heracleopolis. For years the conflict simmered as both sides attempted to expand their authority across the Nile Valley. Mentuhotep chose a different approach. Instead of relying solely on military conquest, he combined political alliances, administrative reforms, and calculated warfare to strengthen his position. Gradually, the territories between Thebes and the northern kingdom began to shift in his favor. Then came the final confrontation. Though the exact details remain uncertain, historical evidence suggests that Mentuhotep's forces, eventually defeated the rulers of Heracleopolis and brought the entire Nile Valley under Theban control. Egypt was united once more. The victory marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, an era often described as a golden age of Egyptian stability and cultural achievement. But the lessons of the past had not been forgotten. The rulers of the Middle Kingdom understood that the Old Kingdom had collapsed partly because too much power had been concentrated in monumental projects and distant royal authority. They sought a new balance between centralized control and regional administration. Mentuhotep II moved the capital southward, strengthening ties with Thebes while maintaining influence over the northern regions. He reorganized the government, placing loyal officials in key positions and reasserting royal authority over the nomarchs who had grown powerful during the previous century. Gradually, the central state regained its strength. Yet the Middle Kingdom differed from the Pyramid Age in important ways. Instead of focusing primarily on gigantic monuments, these rulers emphasized practical governance and economic development. Irrigation systems were restored and expanded, improving agricultural productivity across the Nile Valley. Trade networks were revitalized. Expeditions traveled south into Nubia to access gold mines and exotic resources. Trade routes extended into the Levant, bringing cedar wood, copper, and luxury goods into Egypt. The kingdom began to flourish again. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Middle Kingdom was its cultural transformation. Literature blossomed during this period, producing some of the earliest known works of storytelling and philosophical reflection. Texts such as The Tale of Sinu explored themes of exile, identity, and loyalty to the king. Other writings, like the Admonitions of Ipuwer, reflected on the chaos of the First Intermediate Period and warned about the dangers of political instability. Egyptians were beginning to record not just royal triumphs, but also human experiences. Religion also evolved. While the Old Kingdom had focused heavily on the divine status of the pharaoh, the Middle Kingdom saw greater emphasis on the spiritual destiny of ordinary people. Beliefs about the afterlife expanded beyond royalty, allowing more individuals to hope for eternal existence through proper rituals and moral conduct. The famous Book of the Dead traditions began to develop during this era. Meanwhile, Egyptian art took on new realism and emotional depth. Sculptures portrayed rulers with subtle expressions rather than idealized perfection. Tomb paintings depicted scenes of daily life, agriculture, hunting, and family relationships. The civilization was becoming more introspective, yet stability required constant effort. Following Mentuhotep II, several strong rulers maintained the unity of Egypt, but none shaped the Middle Kingdom more dramatically than Amenemhat I. Amenemhat came to power around 1991 BCE and founded the 12th dynasty. Recognizing the importance of administrative control, he moved the capital northward again to a newly established city called Ichtoy. From this strategic location near the Nile center, the government could monitor both Upper and Lower Egypt more effectively. Amenemhat also introduced an innovative system of co-regency. Instead of waiting until his death for a successor to take power, he appointed his son as co-ruler during his lifetime. This ensured a smoother transition of authority and reduced the risk of civil conflict. The policy would become a hallmark of Middle Kingdom governance. Under Amenemhat and his successors, Egypt experienced renewed prosperity. Massive irrigation projects transformed regions such as the Fayyum Oasis into productive agricultural land. Fortresses were built along the southern frontier in Nubia to protect trade routes and prevent invasion. These forts also allowed Egypt to control the flow of goods and people along the Nile corridor. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs were not merely kings. They were administrators, engineers, and strategists who understood that long-term stability depended on careful management of resources and territory. Yet even the strongest systems face unforeseen challenges. By the late 12th and early 13th dynasties, the central government once again began to weaken. The co-regency system faltered as shorter reigns created uncertainty. Provincial officials regained influence, and the administrative structure that had held Egypt together began to loosen. At the same time, new groups of people were migrating into the eastern Nile Delta. These migrants came from regions of the Levant and Western Asia. At first they arrived as traders, laborers, and settlers seeking opportunity within Egypt's prosperous economy. But over time, their presence would reshape the political landscape of the Delta. As royal authority declined during the late Middle Kingdom, these foreign groups gained increasing autonomy in northern Egypt. Within a few generations, they would establish their own ruling dynasty. Egypt had survived internal fragmentation before, but now it was about to face something new: foreign rule. A power unlike any the Nile Valley had ever experienced was rising quietly in the north, and the age of Egyptian certainty was about to be tested once again. For centuries, the Nile had been Egypt's shield. Its deserts formed natural barriers to the east and west, its cataracts guarded the southern frontier, and its long river valley allowed Egyptian rulers to monitor the movement of people and armies with relative ease. Geography had helped preserve the unity of the kingdom through periods of turmoil and recovery. But geography could not stop every force. During the late Middle Kingdom, a quiet transformation was unfolding in the fertile lands of the Nile Delta. Traders from the Levant had long traveled into Egypt carrying goods such as timber, metals, oils, and crafted materials that Egypt itself lacked. Many of these traders settled temporarily in the Delta to facilitate commerce. Over generations, some of these settlements became permanent communities. Their languages, customs, and technologies slowly blended with Egyptian society. They were not initially invaders. They were immigrants, merchants, and laborers drawn by the wealth of a stable civilization. But as the authority of the Egyptian state weakened during the 13th dynasty, these foreign communities began to organize themselves politically. What emerged from this process would become one of the most mysterious and debated chapters in Egyptian history: the rise of the Hyksos. The term Hyksos comes from an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands. Rather than a single tribe or nation, the Hyksos were likely a coalition of groups from the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia who had gradually established power within the Delta. By around 1650 BCE, they controlled significant portions of northern Egypt. Their capital was established at Avaris, a bustling city in the eastern delta that quickly grew into an international hub of trade and military activity. From this strategic position, Hyksos leaders consolidated their authority over Lower Egypt, while the traditional Egyptian rulers continued to hold power in Thebes in the south. Egypt was divided again, but this time the division carried a deeper psychological impact. For the first time since the unification under Narmer more than a millennium earlier, foreigners ruled part of the Nile Valley. The Hyksos did not destroy Egyptian culture. In fact, they adopted many aspects of it. They used Egyptian titles, participated in local religious practices, and governed through administrative structures similar to those of earlier dynasties. Yet they also introduced something that would forever change Egyptian warfare: new technology. Among the most important innovations brought by the Hyksos was the horse-drawn chariot. While horses had existed in the Near East for centuries, they had never been widely used in Egypt before this period. The chariot allowed armies to move with unprecedented speed across open terrain. The Hyksos also introduced advanced composite bows, new forms of bronze weaponry, and improved military tactics that had developed in the wider Near Eastern world. These technologies gave them a decisive advantage. Egyptian armies of the Middle Kingdom had been formidable, but were still organized largely around infantry forces equipped with traditional weapons. Against mobile chariot units and superior archery, they struggled to compete. For decades, the Hyksos ruled northern Egypt while the Theban kings governed the south. The period that followed is often called the Second Intermediate Period, and it was marked by uneasy coexistence between these rival powers. Trade continued along the Nile, diplomatic contacts occurred between courts, and cultural exchange flowed between the two regions. But beneath this fragile balance lay growing resentment. To many Egyptians, the presence of foreign rulers in the Delta represented a profound disruption of the cosmic order that the pharaoh was supposed to maintain. The kings of Thebes increasingly portrayed themselves as defenders of Egyptian tradition against outside domination. One of the earliest figures to challenge the Hyksos was a Theban ruler named Akhenaten. Historical sources about Akhenaten are limited, but one artifact reveals the violence of his struggle. His mummy, discovered centuries later, shows severe head wounds likely inflicted by battle axes. The injuries suggest that he may have died during direct conflict with Hyksos forces. His death did not end the resistance. Instead, it intensified it. Akhenaten's sons would continue the fight. The first of these was Kamos, a fierce and determined ruler who launched military campaigns northward against the Hyksos territories. In inscriptions carved onto monuments, Kamos described his determination to drive the foreigners out of Egypt. He criticized the political division of the country, declaring that it was unacceptable for a ruler of Egypt to tolerate rival kings within the Nile Valley. Kamos's forces advanced north along the river, attacking Hyksos strongholds and disrupting their supply networks. Yet his reign was short. Before the struggle could be completed, Kamos died, leaving the final confrontation to his younger brother. Ahmose. I would become one of the most important figures in Egyptian history, though his name is sometimes overshadowed by the famous pharaohs who followed him. Ascending the throne while still young, Ahmose inherited the responsibility of finishing the war that his father and brother had begun. But he also inherited something equally valuable: experience. Years of conflict had taught the Egyptians the weaknesses and strengths of Hyksos warfare. They had observed chariot tactics, studied enemy weapons, and begun adopting many of the same technologies themselves. The Hyksos had introduced new tools of war. Now the Egyptians would use them. Ahmose reorganized the Egyptian military into a more professional and flexible force. Chariots were incorporated into the army, and archery units were trained to match the composite bows used by their enemies. Then the campaigns began. Ahmose's forces pushed northward through the Nile Valley, reclaiming territories that had been under Hyksos influence for decades. Each victory strengthened his position and weakened the foreign regime at Avaris. Finally, the decisive battle came. Egyptian forces attacked the Hyksos capital itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that the siege of Avaris was intense. Fortifications were breached, defensive lines collapsed, and the Hyksos leadership was forced to retreat. But the conflict did not end there. Rather than simply driving the Hyksos out of Egypt, Ahmose pursued them beyond the borders of the Nile Valley into southern Canaan. This pursuit ensured that the defeated rulers could not easily regroup and threaten Egypt again. The campaign ended with the destruction of the Hyksos stronghold at Sharuhan. After years of warfare, the foreign dynasty that had ruled northern Egypt was gone. Ahmose returned to Thebes not merely as a victorious king, but as the founder of a new era. His triumph marked the beginning of the New Kingdom. Unlike the Middle Kingdom rulers who had focused primarily on internal stability, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom would adopt a far more aggressive foreign policy. The Hyksos experience had taught Egypt a powerful lesson. Isolation was no longer enough to guarantee security. Foreign powers could infiltrate the Nile Delta, establish footholds, and challenge Egyptian sovereignty. To prevent this from happening again, Egypt would need to extend its influence beyond its traditional borders. The pharaoh would no longer simply defend the Nile. He would dominate the surrounding world. Ahmose began this transformation by reorganizing the state and strengthening the military institutions that had emerged during the war. The army became a permanent and professional force rather than a temporary assembly of regional troops. Military commanders gained new prominence within Egyptian society. At the same time, Ahmose restored economic stability. Lands that had been disrupted during decades of conflict were redistributed, agricultural production was revived, and temples damaged during the wars were rebuilt. The kingdom began to recover, but something fundamental had changed. The Egyptians who emerged from the Hyksos Wars were not the same people who had once built the pyramids of the Old Kingdom. They had seen foreign rule, learned new technologies, and developed a military tradition that would reshape their civilization. Egypt was becoming an empire. Future pharaohs would expand their influence into Nubia in the south and deep into the lands of the Levant in the north. Armies would march farther from the Nile than ever before, carrying Egyptian authority across vast territories. The transformation had begun. Yet the new kingdom would produce rulers whose ambitions reached far beyond military conquest. Some would build temples of breathtaking scale. Others would attempt religious revolutions that shook the foundations of Egyptian belief. And among them would rise one of the most powerful and controversial leaders the world has ever known. A ruler whose monuments still tower above the Nile Valley. A pharaoh whose name would become synonymous with the height of Egyptian power. The age of empire had arrived. When Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos and reunited Egypt, he did more than restore the throne of the pharaoh. He changed the direction of Egyptian history. For centuries, Egypt had existed largely within the protective corridor of the Nile Valley, focused on internal stability and divine kingship. The Hyksos occupation shattered that sense of security. It proved that foreign powers could penetrate the delta, seize territory, and challenge Egyptian authority. The lesson was unmistakable. If Egypt wished to survive, it could no longer remain passive. The pharaohs of the new kingdom would transform Egypt from a defensive civilization into an expansionist empire. The architects of this transformation were not only kings, but generals, administrators, and priests, who understood that military strength, economic wealth, and religious legitimacy were inseparable forces within Egyptian society. Among the earliest rulers to shape this new imperial vision was Amenhotep I, son of Ahmose. Amenhotep inherited a kingdom still recovering from decades of war. His reign focused on strengthening the internal foundations of the state while continuing the cautious expansion that his father had begun. Military expeditions pushed south into Nubia, a region rich in gold mines and valuable resources. Control of Nubia would become one of the most important strategic objectives of the new kingdom. Gold from these territories financed monumental construction projects and strengthened the economic base of the pharaoh's authority. Egyptian administrators established fortified settlements along the Nile's southern reaches, ensuring that trade and tribute flowed northward toward the heart of the kingdom. But the true transformation of Egypt into a major imperial power would occur under a ruler who was not expected to govern at all. Her name was Hatshepsut. When Pharaoh Thutmose II died, his heir was a young boy, Thutmose III. According to tradition, a regent was needed to rule until the child reached maturity. That regent was Hatshepsut, the widow of the deceased king and a member of the royal bloodline. At first, she ruled in the expected role of caretaker for the young pharaoh. But within a few years, Hatshepsut took an unprecedented step. She declared herself pharaoh. In a society where kingship was overwhelmingly male, this decision was revolutionary. Egyptian religion portrayed the pharaoh as the living embodiment of Horus, a divine role traditionally expressed through masculine imagery and symbolism. Hatshepsut confronted this challenge with remarkable political intelligence. Rather than rejecting traditional imagery, she embraced it. Statues and reliefs depicted her wearing the royal kilt, the ceremonial false beard, and other symbols of kingship normally reserved for male rulers. In inscriptions, she referred to herself using the titles of a pharaoh. Yet she also emphasized her legitimacy through divine lineage. Temple inscriptions described how the god Amen himself had chosen her to rule Egypt. According to these accounts, Amen appeared to her mother in divine form, fathering the future queen who would one day guide the kingdom. By combining political authority with religious mythology, Hatshepsut secured her place on the throne. But her legacy would be defined not by controversy. It would be defined by prosperity. Hatshepsut's reign became one of the most stable and economically vibrant periods of the early New Kingdom. Instead of focusing solely on military conquest, she expanded Egypt's wealth through trade and monumental construction. One of her most famous achievements was an expedition to the distant land of Punt. The exact location of Punt remains debated, though many historians place it somewhere along the Red Sea coast of modern Eritrea or Somalia. To the Egyptians, Punt was a land of extraordinary riches, filled with incense trees, exotic animals, gold, ebony, and rare goods that were highly valued in Egyptian temples. Hatshepsut organized a large maritime expedition that sailed south along the Red Sea. The mission was a success. Ships returned loaded with incense trees, myrrh, ivory, baboons, and precious materials that enriched Egypt's religious and economic life. Reliefs carved into temple walls at Deir el-Bahri vividly depict the voyage, showing foreign landscapes, unfamiliar architecture, and the exchange of gifts between Egyptian envoys and the rulers of Punt. These scenes provide one of the most detailed visual records of international trade from the ancient world. Yet perhaps Hatshepsut's most enduring legacy lies in her architecture. Near the cliffs of western Thebes, she commissioned one of the most elegant structures in Egyptian history, the mortuary temple of Deir el-Bahri. Terraced levels rose against the dramatic limestone cliffs, connected by grand ramps and colonnades. The temple blended natural landscape with human design in a way that reflected both artistic mastery and spiritual symbolism. Here priests performed rituals honoring the queen long after her death. But while Hatshepsut focused on prosperity and diplomacy, another figure quietly prepared for his moment. Thutmose III. For many years he had ruled as co-pharaoh alongside Hatshepsut, though she held the dominant authority. When she died around 1458 BCE, Thutmose III assumed full control of the throne. What followed would reshape Egypt's position in the ancient world. Thutmose III was not merely a ruler. He was a conqueror. Historians often refer to him as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, though his achievements came more than 3,000 years earlier. Determined to secure Egypt's borders and expand its influence, Thutmose launched a series of military campaigns that would extend Egyptian authority across vast territories. His most famous campaign targeted the city of Megiddo in the Levant. Coalitions of Canaanite rulers had formed alliances that threatened Egypt's northern interests. To confront them, Thutmose led his army across the Sinai Peninsula toward the city. During the approach to Megiddo, Egyptian commanders advised caution. Several routes led to the battlefield, and some were safer than others. But Thutmose chose the most dangerous path, a narrow mountain pass where his army would be vulnerable to ambush. The gamble paid off. Emerging unexpectedly from the pass, Egyptian forces caught the opposing coalition by surprise and defeated them in battle. The victory secured Egyptian dominance over much of the Levant and established a pattern of annual campaigns that maintained imperial control. Under Thutmose III, Egypt reached the height of its territorial expansion. Egyptian authority extended south into Nubia and north through Syria, reaching the Euphrates River. Cities and kingdoms across these regions paid tribute to the pharaoh, sending gold, silver, livestock, textiles, and skilled craftsmen to Egypt. The empire enriched the Nile Valley. Foreign goods flooded Egyptian markets, and wealth financed an explosion of temple construction across the kingdom. Temples dedicated to Amen, the chief god of Thebes, became particularly important. The priesthood of Amen grew immensely powerful during this time, accumulating land, wealth, and influence that rivaled even the authority of the pharaoh. The temple complex at Karnak expanded into one of the largest religious structures ever built. Towering columns, obelisks, and massive pylons transformed the landscape of Thebes into a sacred city. Religion and empire became deeply intertwined. Victories in battle were portrayed as proof that the gods favored Egypt's rulers. Relief carvings depicted pharaohs smiting enemies beneath the watchful gaze of divine beings. Yet the immense power accumulated by the priesthood would eventually create tensions within Egyptian society. For the moment, however, the new kingdom appeared unstoppable. Egypt had become the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean world. Its armies were feared, its temples were magnificent, and its rulers commanded resources beyond anything imagined during earlier dynasties. But even at the height of imperial strength, change was approaching. A new pharaoh would soon ascend the throne with ideas so radical that they would challenge the very foundations of Egyptian religion. He would attempt to reshape the spiritual identity of an entire civilization, and in doing so, he would ignite one of the most controversial episodes in the long history of Egypt. The empire stood at its peak, yet the greatest upheaval of the new kingdom was about to begin. At the height of Egypt's imperial power, when its armies marched across foreign lands and its temples glittered with gold from Nubian mines, few could have imagined that the greatest upheaval in Egyptian history would come not from an invading army or economic collapse, but from the mind of a single pharaoh. His name was Amenhotep IV. He inherited a world of extraordinary stability. The empire forged by Thutmose III still stretched across Nubia and the Levant. Tribute flowed into Egypt from dozens of subject states. The great temple complexes of Thebes dominated the religious life of the kingdom, and the priesthood of Amen wielded immense influence over society. Yet Amenhotep IV would soon challenge the very system that had made Egypt powerful. To understand his revolution, one must first understand the role of religion in Egyptian civilization. For Egyptians, religion was not merely a belief system. It was the framework that explained every aspect of existence. The gods governed the movement of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the fertility of the land, and the destiny of the human soul after death. Temples were the centers of economic and political power as well as spiritual devotion. The priests who managed these temples controlled enormous wealth, agricultural lands, and labor forces. Over generations, the cult of Amen, centered in Thebes, had grown particularly influential. Amen was worshipped as the hidden force behind creation, a god whose power was universal yet mysterious. His temples received vast donations from pharaohs eager to demonstrate their devotion and secure divine favor. But with wealth came power. By the time Amenhotep IV ascended the throne around 1353 BCE, the priesthood of Amen had become one of the most powerful institutions in Egypt. And the new pharaoh was not comfortable with that balance. In the early years of his reign, Amenhotep IV began promoting the worship of a different deity, the Aten. The Aten was not entirely new. Egyptians had long associated the sun with divine power, and earlier rulers had honored solar gods such as Ra and Amun-Ra. But the Aten was represented differently. Instead of a human-like god with elaborate mythology, the Aten was depicted as the visible disk of the sun itself, whose rays extended downward like hands offering life to the world. At first, this emphasis seemed like a theological preference rather than a revolution, but the change quickly accelerated. Within a few years, Amenhotep IV began constructing temples dedicated exclusively to the Aten, even within the sacred city of Thebes. These temples differed dramatically from traditional Egyptian architecture. Instead of dark inner sanctuaries reserved for priests, Aten temples were open to sunlight, emphasizing the direct presence of the sun's rays. Then the pharaoh took an even more radical step. He changed his name. Amenhotep, meaning Amen is satisfied, was replaced with a new identity, Akhenaten. The new name meant effective for the Aten. With this transformation, Akhenaten publicly rejected the traditional religious hierarchy that had dominated Egypt for centuries. Temples dedicated to Amun were closed. Priests lost their privileges and influence. Images of older gods were defaced or removed. The religious landscape of Egypt was being rewritten. But Akhenaten's revolution did not stop there. Determined to free his new religious vision from the influence of the Theban priesthood, he made an unprecedented decision. He abandoned the traditional capital entirely. In the desert plains halfway between Memphis and Thebes, Akhenaten ordered the construction of a completely new city. Its name was Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today the site is known as Amarna. Built with astonishing speed, the city became the center of Akhenaten's religious experiment. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, and residential districts spread across the desert landscape. Unlike the ancient temples of Egypt, the architecture of Akhenaten reflected the open and radiant symbolism of the sun disk. Sunlight flooded courtyards and sanctuaries, where offerings were made directly to the Aten. The city was not merely a capital. It was the physical embodiment of Akhenaten's new worldview. Even Egyptian art changed dramatically during this period. For centuries, Egyptian artistic style had followed strict conventions. Pharaohs were depicted with idealized proportions and eternal youthful perfection. Under Akhenaten, these rules vanished. Art from the Amarna period portrays the royal family in strikingly unconventional forms. Akhenaten himself is shown with elongated facial features, narrow shoulders, wide hips, and an almost androgynous appearance. Scenes depict the royal family engaging in intimate domestic moments, kissing their children, sitting together beneath the rays of the Aten. This artistic transformation may have reflected Akhenaten's theological ideas. The Aten was not represented in human form, and the pharaoh served as the primary intermediary between the god and humanity. In many depictions, the sun's rays extend toward Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, emphasizing their unique connection to divine power. Nefertiti herself became one of the most recognizable figures of ancient Egypt. Her famous bust, discovered centuries later, reveals a face of remarkable elegance and authority. During Akhenaten's reign, she appeared prominently in religious rituals and artistic representations, suggesting that she held extraordinary influence within the royal court. Together, Akhenaten and Nefertiti led what may have been the closest thing to monotheism ever attempted in ancient Egypt. The Aten was presented as the sole universal deity, the creator of all life and the source of cosmic order. Yet outside the walls of Akhenaten, the reaction to these changes was far less enthusiastic. For ordinary Egyptians, the traditional gods were deeply woven into everyday life. Families prayed to local deities for protection, healing, and guidance. Temples provided employment, food distribution, and social stability. Akhenaten's reforms disrupted these traditions. Moreover, while the pharaoh focused intensely on religious transformation, the political realities of Egypt's empire began to deteriorate. Diplomatic letters discovered in the ruins of Amarna revealed desperate messages from Egyptian allies in the Levant. These rulers pleaded for military assistance against rising threats from rival kingdoms, but many of these appeals went unanswered. Akhenaten appeared far more concerned with religious devotion than with maintaining Egypt's foreign territories. Gradually, Egyptian influence in parts of Syria and Canaan began to weaken. The empire that had been forged through generations of military campaigns was starting to slip away. Inside Egypt, resentment grew among officials, priests, and military leaders who saw the new religious policies as dangerous and destabilizing. Akhenaten ruled for approximately 17 years. By the time of his death, the once mighty new kingdom stood at a crossroads. The religious revolution had alienated powerful institutions. Foreign territories were slipping from Egyptian control, and the royal succession itself was uncertain. After Akhenaten's death, a brief and confusing period followed. Several short-lived rulers may have held power, including a mysterious figure named Smenkhkare. But soon another young king ascended the throne. His original name was Tutankhaten. Within a few years, that name would change. Tutankhamun. Under the guidance of powerful advisors, the young king reversed Akhenaten's religious policies. Temples of the old gods were reopened. The worship of Amun and other traditional deities was restored. Akhenaten was gradually abandoned. The capital returned to Memphis and Thebes. Egypt was attempting to erase the memory of Akhenaten's revolution. His monuments were dismantled. His name was omitted from official king lists. Later generations would remember him not as a visionary but as a heretic. Yet the consequences of his reign could not be entirely undone. The political structure of Egypt had been shaken. Foreign rivals had grown stronger during the years of neglect. The new kingdom still possessed enormous wealth and military strength. But the age of unquestioned imperial dominance was beginning to fade. Soon, new rulers would attempt to restore Egypt's power through conquest, monumental building, and relentless displays of royal authority. Among them would rise a figure whose legacy would eclipse nearly every other pharaoh in history. A king whose monuments would cover the Nile Valley. A ruler whose ambition would define the final great chapter of Egypt's imperial age. The world would remember him by one name, Ramses. When the dust of Akhenaten's religious revolution settled, Egypt faced a difficult reality. The empire built by the warrior pharaohs of the early New Kingdom had begun to weaken. Foreign territories once firmly under Egyptian control were slipping away. Powerful rivals in the Near East were growing stronger, and the internal stability of Egypt had been shaken by years of religious upheaval. The restoration of traditional religion under the young king Tutankhamun helped stabilize the kingdom, but his reign was short. Tutankhamun died around the age of 19. His tomb, discovered thousands of years later, would become the most famous archaeological discovery in history. Yet during his lifetime, the young king was not the dominant force guiding Egypt. Real power lay in the hands of experienced advisors and military leaders who worked behind the throne. One of these men would soon claim the crown himself. His name was Horemheb. Before becoming pharaoh, Horemheb had served as a general under Tutankhamun. He understood the fragile state of Egypt's military and administrative systems. The religious chaos of the Amarna period had disrupted government institutions and weakened Egypt's authority abroad. When Horemheb became king, he launched a campaign to restore order. He reorganized the army, punished corrupt officials, and rebuilt the bureaucratic structure that allowed Egypt to function as a powerful centralized state. Horemheb also worked to erase the legacy of Akhenaten completely, removing references to the Amarna rulers from official records. To later generations, it would appear as if Akhenaten had never existed. But Horemheb faced a problem common to many aging rulers. He had no surviving heir. To secure the future of the kingdom, he selected a trusted military commander to succeed him. This man would become the founder of a new dynasty. His name was Ramses. When Ramses I took the throne around 1292 BCE, he was already advanced in age. His reign was brief, lasting only a few years, but it established a new royal line that would dominate Egypt for generations. The true architect of the dynasty's power was Ramses' son. Seti I Seti inherited a kingdom determined to reclaim its lost influence in the eastern Mediterranean. During the decades following Akhenaten's rule, Egypt had lost control over many of its northern territories. Meanwhile, a formidable new empire had risen in Anatolia. The Hittites. The Hittite Empire had expanded rapidly across Asia Minor and into northern Syria. Their armies were highly organized and equipped with advanced chariot forces that rivaled Egypt's own military technology. Control of Syria and the Levant had become the central geopolitical struggle, of the Late Bronze Age. Seti I launched campaigns to restore Egyptian authority in these regions. His armies marched north through Canaan, capturing rebellious cities and re-establishing Egyptian influence. Inscriptions carved into temple walls celebrate his victories, depicting the pharaoh striking down enemies beneath the protection of the gods. Although Seti achieved significant successes, the struggle with the Hittites remained unresolved. It would fall to his son to confront this powerful rival directly. That son would become one of the most famous rulers in the entire history of Egypt. Ramses II. Later generations would call him Ramses the Great. He ascended the throne around 1279 BCE and ruled for an astonishing 66 years. During this long reign, Ramses transformed the landscape of Egypt with monuments, temples, statues, and inscriptions that proclaimed his achievements across the Nile Valley. Few rulers in human history have invested so heavily in shaping their own legacy. But Ramses was not merely a builder of monuments. He was also a warrior king. Early in his reign, Ramses turned his attention toward the northern frontier, where the Hittite Empire continued to challenge Egyptian dominance. The most famous confrontation between these two powers occurred at the city of Kadesh, located along the Orontes River in modern-day Syria. The Battle of Kadesh would become one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. Ramses led a massive army northward composed of several divisions named after Egyptian gods, Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set. These divisions advanced along different routes toward the city, but the campaign began with a dangerous mistake. Egyptian scouts captured two men who claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army. They reported that the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, was far to the north and posed no immediate threat. The information was false. In reality, the Hittite army was waiting nearby in ambush. As Ramses' Amun division approached Kadesh, thousands of Hittite chariots suddenly attacked the Egyptian camp. The surprise assault scattered Egyptian forces and created chaos across the battlefield. For a moment, the entire campaign seemed on the verge of disaster. According to Egyptian inscriptions, Ramses himself rallied his troops and launched a fierce counterattack, driving back the Hittite chariots and stabilizing the situation. Whether the king truly fought with such heroic intensity remains debated by historians. What is certain is that the battle ended without a decisive victory for either side. The Egyptians claimed triumph in their records, while the Hittites maintained control of Kadesh afterward. In practical terms, the battle was a stalemate. Yet Ramses turned the event into one of the greatest propaganda victories in history. Across Egypt, temple walls were covered with detailed reliefs depicting the king heroically defeating overwhelming enemy forces. These scenes portrayed Ramses as a warrior chosen by the gods to protect Egypt against foreign threats. The narrative became legendary, but the geopolitical reality was more complicated. The struggle between Egypt and the Hittite Empire continued for years after the battle. Neither side could achieve total dominance over the contested territories of Syria and the Levant. Eventually, both empires recognized the need for a different solution: diplomacy. Around 1259 BCE, Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III concluded what is widely considered the world's earliest known peace treaty. The agreement established a formal alliance between the two powers. Both kingdoms pledged mutual defense against external enemies and promised not to support rebellions within each other's territories. Copies of the treaty were inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. One version of the document still exists today on the walls of the temple at Karnak. The treaty brought stability to the region and allowed Ramses to focus on monumental construction projects throughout Egypt, and few pharaohs built more than he did. Temples dedicated to the gods rose across the kingdom. Among the most breathtaking are the temples of Abu Simbel in Nubia. Carved directly into a mountainside, the complex features four colossal statues of Ramses II seated at the entrance, each towering more than 20 meters high. Inside, the temple chambers celebrate the king's divine authority and military achievements. The structures were not merely religious buildings. They were political statements carved into stone. Ramses also expanded the great temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, constructed massive statues of himself throughout Egypt, and built a new royal capital in the Nile Delta known as Ramesses. Under his reign, Egypt projected an image of unmatched grandeur. Yet even as Ramses celebrated the glory of his empire, deeper forces were beginning to reshape the ancient world. Across the eastern Mediterranean, powerful civilizations were entering a period of crisis. Trade networks that had connected Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, and other kingdoms for centuries began to collapse. Waves of mysterious raiders, later called the Sea Peoples, would soon sweep across coastal regions, destroying cities and destabilizing entire societies. The stability that Ramses had achieved through diplomacy and monumental authority could not last forever. By the end of his long reign, the foundations of the late Bronze Age world were beginning to crumble. Egypt would soon face challenges unlike any it had encountered before: foreign invasions, economic disruption, and a slow decline that even the greatest pharaohs could not prevent. The age of Ramses marked the final peak of imperial Egypt. After him, the civilization that had dominated the Nile Valley for more than 1,000 years would begin its long descent toward transformation. Yet Egypt would not disappear. Instead, it would adapt, endure, and confront a changing world where new empires were rising beyond its borders. The story of Egypt was far from over, but the era of unquestioned dominance was fading into history. When Ramses II died in 1213 BCE, he left behind a kingdom that appeared magnificent and secure. Temples stretched across the Nile Valley, colossal statues proclaimed his glory, and Egypt remained one of the most recognizable powers of the ancient world. For 66 years, Ramses had ruled with extraordinary authority, outliving many of his own heirs and shaping an era defined by monumental architecture and royal propaganda. But time moves relentlessly, and beneath the grandeur of Ramses' achievements, the wider world of the late Bronze Age was beginning to unravel. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the interconnected network of kingdoms that had dominated international politics for centuries was entering a period of crisis. The great powers, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, and the city-states of the Levant, had long depended on a delicate system of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, cedar wood from Lebanon, and luxury goods from across the Near East moved along trade routes that sustained entire economies. But by the late 13th century BCE, these networks began to fracture. Cities burned, trade routes collapsed, and mysterious forces appeared along the coasts of the Mediterranean. Egyptian records would later refer to these groups collectively as the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain one of the most debated mysteries of ancient history. Some scholars believe they were displaced populations from the Aegean and Anatolia, driven southward by famine, war, or environmental collapse. Others suggest they were coalitions of migrating tribes who moved through the Mediterranean in search of new lands. Whatever their origin, their impact was devastating. Around the eastern Mediterranean, powerful kingdoms fell with astonishing speed. The Hittite Empire, once Egypt's greatest rival, collapsed entirely. Mycenaean palaces in Greece were destroyed. Coastal cities across the Levant were burned or abandoned. An entire international system disintegrated. Egypt, however, still stood, but it would soon face the same threat. The successor to Ramses II was his son Merneptah, an aging ruler who inherited a kingdom already feeling the strain of global instability. Early in his reign, Merneptah confronted a coalition of invaders composed of Libyan tribes and allied sea peoples attempting to penetrate Egypt's western frontier. The attack was serious. These forces had not come merely to raid. They came with families, possessions, and wagons, evidence that entire populations were migrating in search of new territory. Merneptah responded decisively. Egyptian forces mobilized to repel the invaders, and inscriptions carved into temple walls celebrate the pharaoh's victory. According to these records, thousands of enemy warriors were killed or captured, and the invasion was crushed before it could spread into the Nile Valley. Yet the danger had not passed. Decades later, during the reign of Ramses III, the Sea Peoples returned. This time the threat was even greater. Ramses III ruled during the 20th dynasty and is often considered the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Determined to defend Egypt's borders, he prepared for the approaching storm with both military planning and strategic fortifications. Egyptian records describe massive movements of sea peoples across the eastern Mediterranean. Entire cities had fallen before them. Now they were approaching Egypt. Ramses III organized both land and naval defenses to intercept the invaders. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred in the Nile Delta, where Egyptian forces prepared to face the incoming fleets of the Sea Peoples. Reliefs carved into the walls of Ramses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depict the battle in vivid detail. Enemy ships approach the delta. Egyptian archers line the riverbanks. Warships engage in brutal combat on the water. The images show chaos, capsized ships, warriors thrown into the river, and prisoners captured by Egyptian soldiers. According to these inscriptions, Egypt achieved a decisive victory. The Sea Peoples were defeated, but victory came at a cost. Even though Ramses III successfully defended Egypt from invasion, the broader world had already changed. Trade networks that once connected Egypt to distant markets were collapsing. Neighboring kingdoms had disappeared, leaving a fractured political landscape across the Near East. Economic pressure began to mount within Egypt itself. The massive temple complexes and administrative institutions of the new kingdom required enormous resources to maintain. Grain supplies fluctuated, and workers responsible for royal construction projects sometimes went unpaid. One of the earliest recorded labor strikes in human history occurred during the reign of Ramses III. Workers in the village of Deir el-Medina, skilled craftsmen responsible for building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, protested when their food rations were delayed. They refused to continue working until the government fulfilled its obligations. The strike was resolved, but it revealed deeper problems within the Egyptian economy. Meanwhile, the power of the priesthood continued to grow. Temples dedicated to Amun and other major gods controlled vast estates and resources. High priests in Thebes wielded authority that sometimes rivaled the power of the pharaoh himself. Over time, this concentration of religious influence weakened the central government. Political stability began to erode. Ramses III's later years were marked by internal conspiracies and intrigue. One of the most dramatic events of his reign was a plot known as the Harem Conspiracy. According to surviving legal documents, a group of court officials and members of the royal household attempted to assassinate the king in order to place a different prince on the throne. The conspiracy involved high-ranking individuals, including one of Ramses III's wives. The plot was eventually uncovered, and the conspirators were arrested and tried in a series of dramatic court proceedings. Many were sentenced to death. Yet recent examinations of Ramses III's mummy suggest that the conspiracy may have partially succeeded. Medical scans indicate that the pharaoh suffered a severe throat wound, possibly inflicted during the assassination attempt. If true, Ramses III may have died as a result of the plot. With his death, Egypt entered a new phase of instability. The rulers who followed him carried the name Ramses, but their authority steadily weakened. Economic pressures intensified, and regional leaders began to assert greater independence. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the once powerful new kingdom had effectively collapsed. Egypt fragmented into competing spheres of influence. In the north, kings ruled from cities in the Nile Delta. In the south, the high priests of Amun governed Thebes with increasing autonomy. The unified empire that had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean was gone. Yet Egypt did not disappear. Despite political fragmentation, Egyptian culture, religion, and traditions remained deeply rooted in the Nile Valley. Temples continued to function, priests maintained religious rituals, and local rulers adopted the symbols of pharaonic authority even when their power was limited. For centuries, Egypt would exist as a divided land. Foreign powers would occasionally intervene, and new dynasties would rise and fall within the valley. But beyond Egypt's borders, the world was changing rapidly. New empires were emerging. In the east, the Assyrians were building a military machine unlike any seen before. Later, the Persians would expand across the Near East with overwhelming force. And eventually, another conqueror would arrive from a distant land, a young king from Macedonia whose ambition would carry him across continents. His armies would march into Egypt not as destroyers, but as liberators from Persian rule. And with his arrival, Egypt would enter one of the most fascinating chapters of its ancient history. The age of pharaohs was fading, but the civilization of the Nile was about to meet a new world. By the 7th century BCE, the world that had once been dominated by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom had transformed beyond recognition. The once mighty Egyptian empire had fragmented after the collapse of the 20th dynasty. Regional rulers controlled different parts of the Nile Valley, and foreign influences increasingly shaped the political landscape. Though Egyptian culture endured with remarkable resilience, the era when Egypt dictated the balance of power across the eastern Mediterranean was over. Now, powerful empires were rising beyond its borders. Among the most formidable were the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire, centered in Mesopotamia, had developed an extraordinarily efficient military system. Its armies combined disciplined infantry, powerful siege engines, and ruthless strategies designed to terrify opponents into submission. During the 7th century BCE, Assyrian kings expanded their dominion westward across the Levant. Egypt soon became their target. The Egyptian rulers of this period, known as the 25th dynasty, had origins far to the south in Nubia. These Nubian kings, often called the Kushite pharaohs, had marched northward from their homeland and reunited Egypt under their rule around 744 BCE. The Kushite kings admired Egyptian traditions deeply. They restored temples, revived ancient religious practices, and presented themselves as guardians of Egypt's sacred heritage. Cities like Thebes flourished again under their patronage. Yet their rise alarmed the Assyrians. From the perspective of Assyrian rulers, a unified Egypt under strong leadership represented a serious strategic threat. Conflict between the two powers became inevitable. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon launched a massive invasion of Egypt. Assyrian forces swept across the Sinai Peninsula and into the Nile Delta, defeating Egyptian armies and capturing Memphis. The Kushite pharaoh Taharka was forced to retreat southward into Nubia. For the first time in centuries, Egypt had fallen under the direct control of a foreign empire. Assyrian rule, however, proved difficult to maintain. Egypt's vast geography and deep cultural identity resisted long-term domination. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, forcing the Assyrians to send additional military expeditions to reassert their authority. Within a few decades, Assyria itself began to collapse under pressure from rising powers in Mesopotamia. Out of this shifting political landscape, a new Egyptian dynasty emerged. The 26th dynasty, often called the Sate dynasty, restored native Egyptian rule in the Nile Valley during the late 7th century BCE. Its founder, Psamtik I, skillfully navigated the collapse of Assyrian influence and gradually unified Egypt once more. Unlike earlier pharaohs, however, The Sate rulers recognized that Egypt could no longer isolate itself from the broader Mediterranean world. Instead, they embraced international connections. Greek merchants and mercenary soldiers were welcomed into Egyptian service. Trade flourished between Egypt and the city-states of the Aegean. Foreign communities established settlements in the Nile Delta, creating a multicultural environment unlike any earlier period of Egyptian history. Egypt was adapting, yet the rise of another empire would soon challenge this fragile independence. In the east, the Persian Empire was expanding with astonishing speed. Under the leadership of Cyrus the Great and his successors, Persia conquered vast territories stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean Sea. Their administrative system allowed them to govern enormous regions through provincial governors known as satraps. Egypt was one of the few remaining major powers outside Persian control. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II launched an invasion of the Nile Valley. Egyptian forces attempted to resist the advance, but they were defeated at the Battle of Pelusium near the eastern frontier of the Delta. Persian troops pushed deeper into the country, and the last pharaoh of the Sate dynasty, Psamtik III, was captured. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire. Though the Persians allowed many traditional institutions to continue, their rule represented a profound shift. The pharaoh was no longer an independent ruler, but a title occasionally assumed by Persian kings governing the region from afar. Egypt would rebel several times over the following centuries, briefly regaining independence during certain periods, but Persian power remained dominant. Then, in 332 BCE, a new conqueror arrived. His name was Alexander. Alexander III of Macedon had already defeated the Persian Empire in a series of dramatic campaigns across Asia Minor and the Near East. When his army entered Egypt, the Persians offered little resistance. To the Egyptians, Alexander appeared not as an oppressor but as a liberator. He was welcomed into Memphis with ceremonies honoring him as the new pharaoh. Yet Alexander's ambitions extended far beyond Egypt. While traveling along the Mediterranean coast, he selected a site where the Nile's western branch approached the sea. There he ordered the construction of a new city. Its name would become legendary: Alexandria. Designed as a grand center of trade and culture, Alexandria soon grew into one of the most important cities of the ancient world. Its harbors connected Egypt to Mediterranean commerce, while its famous lighthouse, the Pharaohs, would later stand among the seven wonders of the ancient world. Alexander did not remain in Egypt long. Soon after founding Alexandria, he continued his campaigns eastward toward Persia and India. But before leaving, he visited an oracle deep in the desert at the oasis of Siwa. There, according to ancient accounts, priests declared him the son of the god Amun. For Egyptians, this divine recognition reinforced his legitimacy as pharaoh. Alexander's reign over Egypt, however, would be brief. In 323 BCE, he died suddenly in Babylon at the age of 32. His vast empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell under the control of one of these commanders, a man named Ptolemy. Ptolemy I established himself as ruler of Egypt and founded a dynasty that would govern the country for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty blended Greek and Egyptian traditions in complex ways. Greek became the language of administration and scholarship, while traditional Egyptian religious practices continued throughout the countryside. The rulers of this dynasty adopted the title of pharaoh and participated in Egyptian rituals, but they maintained strong ties to the Greek world. Alexandria became the intellectual heart of this new era. The city's famous library sought to collect every written work in existence. Scholars gathered from across the Mediterranean to study mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt was no longer simply an ancient kingdom of temples and pyramids. It had become a crossroads of civilizations. Yet the Ptolemaic court was also filled with intrigue, rivalries, and internal conflicts. Sibling marriages among the royal family often led to struggles for power. Political alliances shifted rapidly, and beyond Egypt's borders, a new force was rising: Rome. The Roman Republic had expanded across the Mediterranean, defeating powerful rivals such as Carthage, and gradually extending its influence into the eastern territories, once dominated by Alexander's successors. Egypt's wealth, especially its grain production, made it an irresistible prize. The final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty would soon find herself entangled in the ambitions of Rome's most powerful leaders. Her name would become one of the most famous in all of ancient history: Cleopatra. Her reign would mark the final chapter of independent Egypt, and with her fall, the civilization that had endured along the Nile for more than 3,000 years would enter an entirely new age. The age of pharaohs was nearing its end, but the legacy of Egypt would continue to shape the imagination of the world long after its kings had vanished into history. The final chapter of ancient Egypt did not begin with war. It began with a woman. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt was no longer the isolated kingdom of pyramids and divine pharaohs that had once dominated the Nile Valley. Instead, it was a wealthy but politically fragile state ruled by the Greek-descended Ptolemaic dynasty, surrounded by the expanding power of Rome. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had governed Egypt from Alexandria, blending Greek culture with ancient Egyptian traditions. They adopted the title of pharaoh, supported temple construction, and participated in religious rituals that linked them to the long history of the Nile. But their court was famous for intrigue. Royal siblings frequently married each other to preserve dynastic legitimacy. Rival factions within the palace fought for power. Assassinations, betrayals, and shifting alliances became common. In this volatile world, Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE. She was not the first Cleopatra of the Ptolemaic line. Several queens had carried the name before her, but she would become the most legendary. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra was exceptionally well educated. Ancient writers described her as fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, Greek, and possibly others spoken across the eastern Mediterranean. She studied philosophy, science, diplomacy, and rhetoric. More importantly, she possessed extraordinary political intelligence. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra inherited the throne alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she was expected to marry according to dynastic custom. But cooperation between the siblings quickly collapsed. Court advisors manipulated the young Ptolemy XIII, pushing him to challenge Cleopatra's authority. Within a few years, she was forced into exile, leaving Alexandria to gather support beyond Egypt's borders. Meanwhile, events in Rome were reshaping the Mediterranean world. The Roman Republic was locked in a civil war between two of its most powerful leaders, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Their conflict would ultimately determine the future of Roman power and the fate of Egypt. In 48 BCE, Pompey fled to Egypt after suffering defeat in Greece. Hoping to gain favor with Caesar, the advisors of Ptolemy XIII made a fatal decision. They assassinated Pompey upon his arrival. When Caesar reached Alexandria shortly afterward, the gesture did not produce the reaction they expected. Rather than gratitude, Caesar was angered by the murder of a Roman statesman. Egypt now stood at the center of Roman politics. Cleopatra saw her opportunity. According to famous accounts preserved by later historians, she secretly returned to Alexandria and arranged a dramatic meeting with Caesar. One story claims she was smuggled into the palace wrapped inside a carpet or sack of bedding, allowing her to bypass the guards who served her rival brother. Whether the details are true or embellished, the meeting changed everything. Cleopatra and Caesar formed both a political alliance and a personal relationship. Caesar supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne. The conflict that followed, known as the Alexandrian War, ended with the defeat of Ptolemy XIII, who drowned while fleeing a battle along the Nile. Cleopatra was restored as queen. For several years, Egypt existed under the protection of Caesar's power. Cleopatra even traveled to Rome, where she lived as Caesar's guest and gave birth to a son widely believed to be his child, named Ptolemy XV Caesarion. But in 44 BCE, the political landscape shifted once again. Julius Caesar was assassinated by Roman senators who feared his growing authority. His death plunged Rome into another cycle of civil war. From this chaos emerged a new triumvirate of leaders: Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Among them, Antony took responsibility for Rome's eastern territories. It was inevitable that he would encounter the Queen of Egypt. Their first meeting took place in 41 BCE in the city of Tarsus. Cleopatra arrived in spectacular fashion. Ancient descriptions portray her sailing up the river aboard a magnificent barge decorated with golden ornaments and purple sails, surrounded by attendants dressed as mythological figures. The theatrical display was more than extravagance. It was political strategy. Antony, like Caesar before him, quickly became captivated by Cleopatra's charisma and intelligence. Their alliance soon evolved into a romantic relationship that would reshape the fate of Egypt. For several years, Antony and Cleopatra ruled their respective realms while cooperating politically and militarily. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, and together they pursued ambitions that alarmed many leaders in Rome. Antony granted territories in the eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and her children, presenting them as rulers of vast regions during a ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. To supporters in Egypt, these actions appeared as the creation of a powerful Eastern empire. To Antony's rival in Rome, they looked like treason. That rival was Octavian. Octavian carefully crafted a political narrative portraying Antony as a man corrupted by a foreign queen. Roman propaganda depicted Cleopatra as a manipulative seductress determined to dominate Rome through her influence over Antony. Public opinion in Rome shifted. In 32 BCE, the Roman Senate declared war, not against Antony directly but against Cleopatra. The decisive confrontation came the following year: the Battle of Actium. Off the western coast of Greece, the combined naval forces of Antony and Cleopatra faced the fleet commanded by Octavian's brilliant general Agrippa. The battle unfolded in September of 31 BCE. Octavian's forces possessed superior strategy and discipline. During the engagement, Cleopatra's fleet unexpectedly withdrew from the battle, sailing south toward Egypt. Antony followed her, abandoning much of his remaining fleet. Their forces collapsed soon afterward. The defeat at Actium sealed their fate. Octavian advanced toward Egypt, determined to end the conflict permanently. By the summer of 30 BCE, Roman armies entered Alexandria. Antony, believing Cleopatra had died, took his own life. Cleopatra soon realized that she had lost the political game she had played for nearly 2 decades. Octavian planned to capture her and display her as a prisoner in a Roman triumph, a public humiliation that would symbolize Rome's final victory. She refused. According to ancient tradition, Cleopatra arranged her own death, possibly using the venom of a cobra known as an asp. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt was annexed into the Roman Empire as a province governed by Roman officials. For the first time since the unification of Narmer more than 3,000 years earlier, the land of the Nile no longer had its own pharaoh. Yet the story of Egypt did not end with Cleopatra. The temples, monuments, and cultural traditions of Egypt continued under Roman rule. Pilgrims visited ancient sanctuaries, priests maintained rituals, and travelers from across the empire marveled at the pyramids that still dominated the desert skyline. Over centuries, however, the old religious traditions gradually faded. Christianity spread through Egypt during the Roman period. Later, Islamic civilization would reshape the region after the Arab conquests of the 7th century. But even as languages changed and new cultures emerged, the legacy of ancient Egypt never disappeared. The pyramids still stand. The temples of Karnak and Luxor still rise above the Nile. The tombs of the Valley of the Kings still guard the secrets of long-dead pharaohs. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt created one of the most remarkable civilizations humanity has ever known. It developed writing, architecture, religious philosophy, and state administration on a scale that influenced cultures across continents. Its rulers sought immortality. In a way, they achieved it. Because the civilization they built continues to haunt the imagination of the modern world. Every monument carved into the desert tells a story about humanity's earliest attempts to understand eternity. The Egyptians believed that life and death were not separate forces, but parts of an endless cycle, just as the Nile flooded and receded each year. Their civilization rose, transformed, declined, and transformed again. Yet its memory endured. Across thousands of years, across empires and revolutions, the voice of ancient Egypt still echoes through history, not as a ghost of the past, but as a reminder of how deeply human ambition can shape the world.